Thanks, Dave.
Hi. Should I start to share my screen now? Okay, let's do it. And I go window. Oh, and that is so cool, I hope. All right. And you can see my lesson one. All right, that's very good. And in lesson one, I have a short introduction. It's a little bit easier to read. Welcome back to fourth grade. We have come to the fourth unit of fourth grade, and it focuses on the automobile industry in the early 1900s, but then it reaches into today because automobiles are still manufactured today, and people are still looking to be workers in many kinds of industries today. Uh, uh, we will refer back a little bit to farming and lumbering and mining. You'll see that. But let me take you now to Unit 4. As we've said, it talks about automobile manufacturing. It is something that definitely grew and it really changed through time. Um, it started in the early 1900s, and our compelling question is to see how did it happen? How did this amazing industry grow? How did it change? Um, into the supporting questions, we get into, you know, we had people in Michigan and in the United States and other parts of the world who had been using muscle power for thousands of years. And in the early 1900s, they really settled on using engine power instead of the muscle power. So we'll look into that. Um, Automobiles need a lot of parts. That is the second question. Why do we talk about why are we talking about parts? Why are they so important? And the issue is that the early cars, like by the Model T by Henry Ford, they needed 10,000 parts. Today's cars need more than 30,000 parts. Um, Somehow they have to get put together. One thing that we will focus on is people making decisions that help the automobile industry to grow. But then in the last supporting question, you see that, like everything in life, there are going to be difficult times, and especially in the automobile industry, there's going to be competition. Um, we won't spend as much time on lesson two. Lesson two looks at what came after the automobile manufacturing became so important in Michigan. We will look at a bit at how population changed, numbers changed in Michigan, in Detroit, as people came to work in the automobile industry. We'll also talk about present day a bit more. Um, what is happening in the automobile industry today? How do we compare with, how does Michigan compare with the rest of the US and with the rest of the world? Toward the end, we will review some civics fundamentals. We had Luann really thinks it's important to make some review possible so that the students have some experience with civics before they get to fifth grade and the tests in fifth grade. We'll also talk about GLICs, or we'll also work on GLICs about public discourse. So let me get out of this and close that up. And a very short intro, which I think I have here, and I'll share the screen. Oops, I'm so sorry. That's the wrong one. All right. Oops. Okay. We'll start with a brief timeline and we'll put students onto the timeline. Um, in, we look back to Unit 1 and at the Nowland Farm back in the 1830s in Michigan. That is longer ago. That is much earlier than the automobile when it was invented by several men, but including Henry Ford. Uh, we will go on to very briefly use a timeline where the most recent years are at the top and the long ago years are at the bottom. So where would you put your birth year if you were a fourth grader? Where would you put the Nolan family on this timeline? And we have a little bit more refined way of looking at a timeline. We have the 1830s, long ago, at the bottom, and we have more recent years, the 2000s, at the top, and the 1900s are in between. The 2020s are now. Automobile manufacturing began in the early 1900s, and we have the 1830s at the bottom. So we would see, where would fourth graders put their birth year? Would they put it in recent or long ago? Where would we put the Nolan family coming? Where would we put the earliest automobiles? And here are answers. I think that most fourth graders would have been born in the 2010s, several of them anyway, or the earliest automobiles are longer ago, but not as long ago as the Nolan family. So we're getting us situated. That doesn't look like a very fancy car, but this turned out to be a very successful business in Michigan. So we'll get out of that and we will go to the next one. And here we are. We're going to look at muscle power versus engine power. And I think you can see in the first slide, they look different in these simple diagrams. And it's kind of like, well, why don't we use horses anymore? You remember back that the Nolan family used muscle power. It was the muscle power of oxen. And I think you can remember that the Nolan family put their watermelons and other things that they wanted to sell in Detroit, and those oxen pulled the cart 9 miles to Detroit. But things are going to change. Back in Unit 3, when we had these huge manufacturing companies making stoves, for example, here they're making iron stoves. But what do you see in the picture doing all of the hauling, all the moving around? I think I counted at least 7 horses, teams of horses pulling carts in this. It's just like we have Amazon deliveries coming to our front doors today. In the past, the way to get a delivery from a big department store was by horses pulling the cart. You really have to admire. In the bottom picture, we have 2 horses hauling 175 bags of wheat. This is back in the early 1900s. Instead of using a car to go to the grocery store in the past, you'd hitch up 1 or 2 horses and you'd take your carriage. Or if you had to go a longer distance between towns, you might get on a stagecoach. why did people, I think people kind of, especially me, we really think horses are kind of neat. But in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were kind of wanting to find an alternative to the oxen and to the horses. And we'll look at why. Both the oxen and the horses needed to be trained. You just don't press the gas pedal and something goes. You have to tell them with special words that they learned. Um, get up means to go. And if you want to turn left, you don't turn on your blinker. You have to say haw in order that the team of horses who have learned will turn left. Um, Horses and oxen both need care. You'll remember that the Nolans got into terrible trouble because they had trouble providing food for their oxen, and their oxen died. Um, Horses eat a lot. One horse eats 20 to 25 pounds of combination of hay and grain like oats. This is not putting a little bit of food in a bowl for your dog. This is a lot of food to carry out to your horse. Um, Working horses, you had to bring them water. They needed 12 gallons. Isn't that amazing? If they were a working horse, they needed a lot of water each day. You had to take care of their hooves and their hair. And then I don't want to sound gross, but you had to clean up after horses. Um, they make poop. Today we are required to pick up dog poop. Um, and somebody had to clean up the poop in the street in front of the grocery store or in the church parking lot where you park your horses. Um, Horses also had limitations. Yeah, they could work for 8 hours a day, but they needed to take breaks. They had to stop and rest. And it's not like you go to the filling station and get gas, a couple times a week or once a week. That horse had to eat food and drink water at several times during the day. He just had to stop. Horses, carriages also couldn't go very fast. You want to go 10 miles an hour, that's as fast as you could go. And today, most people would like to go faster than that. And I think I can get out of this one. And we'll go to the next one. Because if we're going to not have horses, how are we going to make the cart go? Okay, making the cart go. We have to make the slideshow go. Oops. Oh, it's not happy. Okay, here we go. People were looking for engine power instead of muscle power. This all started in the late 1800s. This obviously in the picture is not an example of engine power. This is one of the very first horseless wagons. Mr. Benz in Germany made, does this look like an automobile? What he did is he took a gasoline engine and he connected it so the power of the engine would make the back wheels turn. And I don't know if you can see, but doesn't that look like a bicycle chain? Instead of using pedal muscle power, Mr. Benz hooked up his small gasoline engine using a bicycle chain. And I don't know if we'll have time to show that, but we can also, you'll also be able to show students how a bicycle chain, that kind of chain, makes things go. You remember that we did hear about steam engines, not gasoline engines, but we heard about steam engines when we saw the Nolan family. For example, the Nolan family rode from New York in a steamboat with a steam engine. You can see the smoke because they're burning coal. The coal heats water. Water heats up. It makes steam, and steam pushes, and the steam drives the great big paddle wheel that makes the boat go. We also saw that Mr. Nolan and his son got to ride in a very early steam engine that pulled railroad cars. Were called coaches back then. Notice the smoke. That steam engine in early Michigan was burning wood to heat water, to make steam, to make the wheels go. We'll see a little bit more about that pretty soon. Um, Here's basically a diagram of how a steam engine works. Notice the pink. The pink is really important. The pink in that picture is the steam, and it's pushing on a thing called a piston. Uh, the piston gets pushed up, and then the piston makes something move. Can you see the fire toward the bottom? That fire is coal heating water to make steam. One more picture of that. This cylinder that I highlighted with yellow, it had to be very strong and very tight so that the piston could go up and down because of the expanding pressure of the steam. I can show you a 32-second video. That's really short, but you notice that they're using that term called a piston that's moving inside the cylinder, and it's all because of that pink steam. That is the power of steam is quite amazing. Um, what I'd also let's see, let's go on. Um, there there is a longer. This is the videos are really neat. I'm going to skip it for sake of time. But the steam engines are just amazing. I just missed all of this when I was a kid to look at steam engines. Um, Different kinds of engines. Well, what kind of engine was going to go into automobiles? Well, it turned out that there were three choices: a steam engine, an electric engine, or a gasoline engine. And what do you guess would be most important? The most Steam engines weren't real popular. You had to have a really big car to hold the water that was going to get heated up and hold the coal that was going to burn. So that wasn't real popular, but there were steam engine cars made in the United States. Even in Detroit, there were. Um, Electric engines, they didn't know they weren't as popular because people didn't know how to make more than 100 years ago. They didn't know how to make batteries that would last a long time. The battery wouldn't carry you very many miles, and it took a really long time to plug it in and charge it up in order to move a car. So what we're going to look at is the most popular on the next slide, gasoline engine, and I have a diagram to shows that. So do you see the piston going up and down? And what's making the piston go down in this case? Can you see that spark that happens at the top? This is called an internal combustion. It's kind of you put This engine has a mixture of air and droplets of gasoline, and then a spark happens and a mini explosion happens that pushes down on the piston and makes things turn. This is what essentially, in a small version, Mr. Benz was successful in first making the little gasoline internal combustion engine and then hooking it up to wheels. And so I'll escape out of this and turn this one off. Oops, wrong one. Okay, I'm going to skip talking about bicycles, but I thought since children are used to bicycles, we'll come back to that if we have time. But children are used to bicycles. It's kind of interesting how bicycles came first, and then the people who invented automobiles used some of the things that are on bicycles that were successful. I'm going to skip down to the really successful car companies that happen to be in Michigan. And we'll do the slideshow. Okay. It wasn't just people in Michigan who invented automobiles. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, all of the states where I put an I on this map of the United States, all of these states had men who were often helped out by their wives, had men who invented various types of automobiles. Some were gasoline engines, some were steam engines, some were electric engine. It turns out that there were three inventors. You only see one I in Michigan, but there were three inventors, all who lived in the eastern part of Michigan. But notice that I think there are kind of regions. There was a region over near the Atlantic Ocean, and there was a region of inventors near the Great Lakes. I am going to show you some of the early automobiles from the late 1800s and the early 1900s. They look funny, but they were major accomplishments. These men all separately, although they had teams often, where they'd be a bunch of mechanics working in a garage, all trying to figure it out. But these are examples of three automobiles that were made in the United States, all using gasoline power. In Massachusetts, Mr. Drea was earliest. Mr. Olds in Michigan was second, and Mr. Ford was third. They all were just people who really liked to make things. Inventing something and actually manufacturing, where manufacture refers to making a large amount of something, not just one that works, but hundreds and thousands, and in the case of Mr. Ford, millions of cars that worked. So we're going to look at a couple of these from Michigan, the Olds Company and the Ford Company. By about 15 years after their first working invention, they were making these automobiles, a 1928 Oldsmobile and a 1927 Ford. Um, Many other companies started in the US about the same time. There probably, in the books that I read, there are more than 1,500 companies, 39 of them probably in Michigan. But it turns out that only a small number of all these companies in the United States um, survived to actually manufacture lots of automobiles. You can probably guess how Michigan companies did. It turns out by 1930, about 100 years ago, the three largest automobile companies in the US were in Michigan. They were called the Big Three: the Ford Company, the General Motors Company, and the Chrysler Company. And they had a major accomplishment. By 1930, these big three companies produced 75% of all cars in the United States. A decade later, in 1940, the big three produced 90% of all cars in the United States. And we're going to look at what decisions did they make that helped them to be so successful? Or what was it about Michigan helped them to be so successful? It's like maybe there were some advantages to being in Michigan. Um, I made a summary here, and then we're going to use some maps and some pictures to see why this is what the books say. Michigan had a central location. It wasn't on the edge of the United States. It was kind of in the middle, but also near people. Michigan had useful resources. It's nice to have iron and copper if you want to build available if you want to build an automobile. Really, really important is number three. Michigan had very wealthy men. We call them investors. They had made money in lumbering. Remember lumbering? They had made money in iron and copper mining and manufacturing. And they had all this money. And they thought, you know, these young companies, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, they may be a good place to put our money. Finally, number four, there's something kind of unique about Michigan. There were lots of workers in Michigan, often in our cities that are near the Great Lakes, who made gasoline engines, not for automobiles, but for boats, which might have been a little bit easier than making them for automobiles. So we had that. There's the four reasons, the advantages. What do you think this map shows? What advantage do you think this map shows? It shows population. The darker the colors, this is 1890, the darker the coloring, the more people you have. Hopefully, if you have more people, there's going to be more people who would be likely to buy the car that you make. And it turns out this is what is called the advantage of the central location where you're likely to find a large population of buyers. These maps show things we've looked at before, pine forests and copper and iron mining. And how would they be advantages? Well, they'd actually be two kinds of advantages. They're good resources, especially the iron, to build really strong bodies for your car. But they also remind us about the wealthy investors who'd made a ton of dollars in lumbering and mining and went, you know, these young companies are worth investing in. Last, you've probably guessed, if we put a gasoline engine together with a Great Lake, we had people experience making gasoline engines. And the next step was to put the gasoline engine onto a carriage or a wagon or a cart and make the wheels go. So we'll get out of that. How am I doing for time? Oh, I'm okay, huh?
You're okay.
All right. We'll get out of that. Um, I am going to skip the review. I will come back. Luann found the coolest, absolutely coolest videos for kids. So be sure to click on the video. It's a history of cars for kids. It shows steam. There really were steam automobiles. You just see all sorts of automobiles. We'll come back to that if we have time. The trouble is, I probably need to get to some huge decisions that got made about building cars in Michigan. So we're going to go to decisions that gave us successful card companies. I know this is a repeat, but this is amazingly successful to end up producing 90% of all cars in the United States. I can tell you the big three would love to be able to do that today, and they don't. And one of their major decisions was what kind of car to build. So we'll take you to that. And I think the Ford company's advertisement sums it up really well. Notice how we've circled what they say on their advertisement. What kind of car are they going to build? It's going to be high quality, of course, but low price. Oh my goodness, what does that mean? That means that the Ford Motor Company, but all of the other big three, wanted to build cars for people, regular people who had less money. They just really weren't interested at first into the rich. Really. There were movie stars. There were gangsters. There were really wealthy lumbermen and mine owners and manufacturers. They could buy expensive luxury. But that's not what the big three were interested. They wanted a small, less expensive, but sturdy car. And just to show you what they were not building for, this Auburn was built next door in northern Indiana by the Auburn Company. And look at how many miles it can go per hour. 100 miles an hour. Oh my goodness. It was expensive. It was heavy. It was fast. Had a huge engine. And I want to show you a comparison. Here we have the Model T on the top. It has the power of the equivalent. It's called 22 horsepower. Of 22 horses, it could go a top speed of 45 miles an hour. Look at the Auburn. For heaven's sakes, 150 horsepower? Good heavens.
Carol, one of the things I wanted to mention, I forgot to talk about it when we met earlier today. I want you to think about the roads that we had during the early times of the automobile and seeing one go 100 miles an hour. I wonder what that looked like.
You kind of wonder where the rich people, and the first, I do have, I didn't get that done, but I'm going to get it done. The first concrete, like fully paved road was built in the city of Detroit. So you can just see all these fancy cars going to that stretch of road in Detroit and going fast. So what a contrast. So we have Mr. Olds, not just Mr. Ford, but Mr. Olds built a less expensive Oldsmobile Model F, and it is not as powerful. It is not as shiny. as a Duesenberg. Duesenbergs used to be nicknamed doozies. It's just amazing to go to Auburn, Indiana, and see them in real life in the museum there. Mr. Ford, in particular, had background with farming. He wanted to make farming easier, so he made these kits where people could take their Ford Model T and put different wheels on the back and use it as a tractor. This obviously could handle an icky old road that was mostly dirt in the past. My dad, in 1910, my dad was a child and he was on the farm about 6 miles from town on a muddy road, and his appendix burst at home. He was gonna die, and they stuck him in the Ford Model T, and they drove through the mud to town where there was a doctor, and my dad was so sick, he had to stay at the doctor's house for 3 months. So it shows you that, the Model T could be a lifesaver. Okay. The point is, we had very sturdy, not super fast, but low cost cars that were the choice of what was going to be manufactured by the big three. Oh, this is all okay. I got to escape out of here. All right. The next big deal was not just what to buy, to build, but how would you build it? Because the whole point was to make it not be so expensive. And let me make this go with the slideshow. The big three decided they didn't maybe necessarily use these words at the time, but our Glicks use these words, and economics uses these words, and manufacturing uses these words. They decided they had to figure out how to do mass production. Okay, you just can't invent something. You got to figure out how to make thousands of things at a low cost. And the key to that was to making sure that every screw that you made or every part for the engine that you made was a standardized part. And we'll explain what that means. And the second part of mass production is, how can you organize putting 10,000 parts together? And they decided to use something called an assembly line. All of the big three companies did that. Mr. Ford was so good at using interchangeable parts and assembly lines that between 1908 and 1927, his factories produced 15 million Model Ts. There was a point, I think it was in 1918, where half of all cars that were being driven in the United States were Model Ts. It was just really popular, but and affordable by regular people. But it's because all of the big three were able to do this because they figured out how to use an assembly line. First, just a bit about an interchangeable part. If you're going to put a screw into a particular part of your car, you want to have thousands and thousands of those screws, and they all have to be alike. They have to be interchangeable. Mr. Ford's Model T, and if you go to the Henry Ford Museum, you will see it all broken apart into pieces. These are some of the bigger pieces, but what had to be put together in an assembly line was 10,000 parts. And that took some planning and some figuring out. And they didn't do it overnight. But when they gradually figured out how to use an assembly line to put all the parts for this Model T together, at first it took 12 and a half hours to make one Model T. After they figured out the assembly line, by 1923, it took 1.5 hours to make a Model T automobile. The cost came down because the workers weren't spending so long. This is called being efficient. The cost came down from $850 for a Model T to $260. That's really a good deal. What is an assembly line? Well, you've got to figure out how to put parts together by using a first step and a second step and a third step and so on. Once you decide on your first step, that gets done at workstation number 1, and a worker, one man or one woman, but it was usually men in the beginning, would sit all the time. He would stay at workstation number 1, and he would put a part together with another part there. When he finished, that part would move. Maybe it got pushed on a tray. Maybe it got pushed on a cart. But that part would move to workstation number 2, where there was a different worker. And that worker always sat there and did a different thing. He put another part on the thing he had just received. We'll take a look. I forget the name of what I've circled in yellow here, but it's an important part, goes together with the engine. And each worker stands in one place and puts 1 or 2 parts into the round thing. And as the round thing goes down the line, the next worker adds his particular part. So we have to kind of imagine. Now, pretty soon you'll be able to look at a video of an assembly line, but these are some still pictures of workstation. I think this is a kind of funny one at a Ford assembly line. This is the finished, over on the left is the finished car, basically all put together. But coming down the blue ramp is the seats that's going to get put on the bottom part, which is being rolled along the red arrow. And I think, oh, that looks kind of scary. But that's how they figured out how to do their assembly line better in over a decade. This is not in a Ford plant. This is in a Dodge factory. They call them plants for some reason. And they found all sorts of interesting ways to move the bottom of a car around. It looks like it's hanging, and somehow it will get pulled to the next workstation. They needed really huge buildings to do this. This is an example of a Cadillac plant factory in Detroit. One of the biggest plants was actually a whole huge series of dozens and dozens of buildings and huge buildings on the Rouge River. This was a Ford plant. Here are photos of modern day. You see a worker, a Hyundai car assembly plant. This is probably in Korea. And this worker he only stays at one workstation. He does one specific task. He adds a part at this workstation. On the bottom is a Tesla factory. Isn't it bright and beautiful looking? And I don't see any person there. In this case, this workstation has a robot, and the robot does one or a set of things that it's programmed to do. So somebody has to know how to do computers in order to make this robot work. Um, but this is modern still pictures. Um, I I'm going to show you the first part of at the top. We have a couple of assembly lines from way more than 100 years ago. They do not look very exciting. In fact, they don't even have sound. I think it's amazing that they were able to make a movie back then. You know, this is a movie without, it's not a talkie. um, and what I want you to watch for, if you look at either of these old ones, is men, basically only men, who stand at a workstation and do the same thing over and over and over again at their workstation. I won't show you a whole bunch, but just to show you, this is 100 years ago. Okay. This is completely silent. This goes back to Detroit. And they want to show you that the Ford company was in a grand, really huge building. It needed to be huge because the assembly line was a line, and it had to be a long line. Later on, they made an even bigger factory, and they're so proud of it. And it had to have these, notice how long those buildings are? They had to have a long line of workstations in there. It's like I know it's a little bit slow, but just wait and see. Look at all those workers. This is hundreds and hundreds of workers. Notice things are moving slowly because the men at the workstation need time to put things onto the car as it moves along. They've skipped a lot of steps, but they are showing you how they made, and this was really Henry Ford, the Ford company's big contribution was be the first to use a moving line. This is the Fords driving the 15 millionth car, Model T.
And that's Henry Ford in the passenger seat, right?
That is Henry Ford and his son Edsel. Yeah. I think that's probably enough. Yeah. You don't have to watch more than that. It in a oh my goodness. I know more about Chevrolet and car manufacturing in Flint now. This is pretty long. I would only go about 3 minutes into it. And this is where the men are doing the same thing over and over and over again. Leave it to China. If you want to see drama in a video,
There's people.
So I'm going to take you out of that, but you can see, boy, you can see robots, and you can see something about China and understand a little bit more about today. We have Toyota, and then we also have Ford videos, and please do watch them and notice the robots. You will see people working in the Toyota plant, and you will see people working in the Ford plant, but notice the kinds of things that people are doing versus what the robots are doing. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Oops, I guess that's it. All right. So assembly lines have changed through time, but they were the key to success. We tried, let's see, do I have, oh, it's getting kind of late. Well, we don't
You have time.
need to take a break. Okay, all righty. Let me just show you something I found that we had started 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, when we first did 4th grade. We were trying to figure out a task that 4th graders could do. How could 4th graders make an assembly line? Oh, and I'm sorry, this is not very big like this. Um, and I'll just read. Suppose a factory owner wants to make a high quality greeting card. And what we decided to do was make a simulation of 4th graders making a high quality greeting card. And this take you, I think you can read, this takes you through what we'd have 4th graders do at the first workstation, the second workstation, the third workstation, and so on. But I think I have, yeah, the PowerPoint is a little bit easier to read. Another way that students could think about planning their own assembly line is they'd want to choose making a product like a beautiful greeting card or a delicious pizza, and they'd have to plan an assembly line, and they do that in steps 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's like, how are they going to break doing the beautiful greeting card up into steps? And each step would be a separate workstation. And then they have to decide which worker would they, or workers would they put at each work session. Would the person need particular skills? They also have to figure out how they're going to move what is done at workstation number 1 to workstation number 2. They're going to have to figure out timing. Are people going to have to spend too long at step number 3, and everybody at step number 4 has to wait? Finally, they're going to have to decide how much they're going to charge for their product. So that's an example, trying to bring this out of huge factories and down to 4th grade.
You could also use the example of Subway sandwich makers.
Oh, yes.
Subway, you start with one person and they slide it down and someone does the other part. Chipotle and Qdoba do the same with their Mexican dishes. So one person starts and someone else does all the toppings. So
that's great. Maybe I can take a photograph.
Yeah.
May I photograph you? Yeah. Okay. So here, just to remind students, Luann also found another. It says Facebook Cars have changed. I could start that one, right?
Yeah.
This is so cool. Oh, and you just click. Oh,
This came across my Facebook feed like 3 days ago, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I gotta see if we can put it in the thing. See if we can put it in the presentation."
do you recognize some of those?
Mm.
This was from my childhood.
Well,
And
and it's cool it's Oldsmobile too because it's, and the song is Cars, if you remember that from the
oh,
'80s. "Here in my car, do-do-do-do-do-do-do." I'll stop singing.
see how they're getting bigger and bigger and heavier and heavier? Well, this one isn't.
See, and that was my worry too, because, I mean, you could just click the X and it'll automatically start showing it,
Okay.
um, but yeah, I didn't know how to do that,
But
so I just sent it
this
to Carol, and Carol was able to plop it in and
this is the first Oldsmobile.
mhm.
Yeah. And it's a little hard to see, but it also has a bicycle chain. I have a picture of that somewhere. Okay. That was really that's so cool. Um, I would like so we have just had automobile companies, the big three in Detroit, Michigan, basically being really successful. But life throws things at you that you didn't always expect. Remember how Mr. Nolan's oxen died? Well, difficult times. And we will make the slideshow go. There were difficult times. You know, if you're an automobile manufacturer, this is a big expense for people. Probably only their house or their rent is a higher expense. And and if people suddenly don't have as much money, car companies are going to have trouble selling cars. That means they probably don't want to manufacture as many cars, which means the workers might not have jobs. It's just difficult. Um, and I'm going to show you pictures about 3 bad times. One was something called the Great Depression in the 1930s. One is a world war in the 1940s. And the last one is a little bit longer. It's about something called an oil crisis, or maybe we should call it a gasoline crisis. And that was in the 1970s. This is such a sad picture. And it's sad because this happened to my grandpa. My grandpa had no job. Um, the Great Depression lasted for many years from in the 1930s. Many people lost their jobs. There are people who lost their homes and their farms. What do the kids see in the picture? Oh my goodness, it says free coffee and donuts, and all these men are standing in line to get free coffee and donuts. Uh, just a few bits of data. In 1933, 1/4 of all workers were unemployed, had no job. Um, my grandma didn't know how the kids were going to eat because the railroad laid off all the workers. They didn't have jobs. 1/3 of farmers lost their farms. The bank took it back. You remember how Mr. Nolan was worried about his mortgage? Farmers couldn't sell anything. They couldn't pay their mortgages. A horrible thing, and this happened to my grandparents too. Out of the 25,000 banks in the United States, 9,000 of them closed their doors and wouldn't let people in. And my grandma and grandpa got to the bank and it had closed and never got their savings out of it. It was very, very sad time. Well, obviously, automobile companies could not sell as many cars during that time. It was hard times for the companies. It was hard times for the workers. This is what World War looks like. There was a World War that involved the United States for 4 years. Students may have grandpas who were in the war, and there was fighting in Europe, there was fighting in North Africa, there was fighting in Asia. And instead of making so many cars, the big three, because they were so good at building things with engines, the big three built tanks, great big planes for dropping bombers. Those were made in Ann Arbor, or not, so in Ypsilanti, at a huge factory. And the big three and other companies all the way over to Muskegon built boats using steel. The boats had to use steel because they were being fired at by machine guns. Now to 1973. This was just when I started teaching school. I taught 7th and 8th graders. And I remember 1973, a big surprise happened. It turns out that people had cars that had gasoline engines, and they were used to going to buying gasoline. And all of a sudden in 1973, the gas station didn't have gasoline anymore. There was a big surprise. Gasoline comes from something called crude oil, which is the stuff piped out of the ground, and then it has to be refined. And the thing is, crude oil isn't everywhere in the world. And the US wasn't finding very much crude oil in the US underground at that time. People in the US didn't realize where they were getting crude oil from in the world. It was from a part of the world that suddenly refused to sell crude oil to the United States. And who was not selling oil? It was countries in the Middle East. Even today, they have the most oil in the entire world. It is much easier for them to pump it out of the ground than it is for us in the United States. In 1973, the US bought 83% of its oil from the Middle East. And then they say, no, we are not going to sell it to you anymore. They were angry. They were angry because of a war in the Middle East where we supported somebody else other than them. And this was a huge shock. This was called an oil embargo, or it's an oil stop selling. If we don't get oil, we can't make gasoline. The president at the time said, oh, not every gas station is going to have gasoline every day. It used to be that if you had an odd number at the end of your license plate, there were certain days when you could go to the gasoline station and buy oil. That's what's called rationing. You only got a limited amount and not all the time. They thought it was more important that businesses, like trucks that had to haul food to grocery stores, um, they they gave them a day where they were the only people who could get gasoline. I don't know if I can take this out if fourth graders don't get it, but you can see here the sudden jump in price in 1973. And the trouble is, this happened again in 1979, also because of Middle Eastern wars. Um, and Americans had a little bit of trouble adjusting because they tended to use a lot of gasoline because this wasn't 1920 anymore. Cars had gotten bigger, they'd gotten heavier, they went more than 45 miles an hour. So, this is to show you a couple examples. Yes, indeed. When I was young, everybody thought these were really cool. These are Cadillacs. They're really heavy and really long and really wide and could go really fast. And they use a lot of gasoline. Well, Americans were used to having bigger cars, and suddenly they were interested in smaller cars. And can you see back here? This is a Model T. Look at this little car back here. It's called a Beetle. It was made in Germany by Volkswagen. It's even smaller than a Model T. It was smaller. Suddenly that became popular. Or this is a car made in Japan. It was a lot smaller. It weighed half as much as a Cadillac. Well, of course it's going to use less gasoline. So there was now some competition. And the American car companies had to figure out how to make smaller cars, and it took a little while. So that's what competition means. I have a video about big cars if you want to watch it. They are kind of funny.
That video is hilarious. Talking about how great the big cars are. It's funny.
And
it's very easy.
This is what was on television in the 1950s. I was like in 7th and 8th grade in the 1950s. And it's like, oh, we thought this was interesting. So kids will be amused, I would imagine. Anyway, after 1973, US automobile makers, it took them a while to make smaller cars that use less gasoline. But yeah, and there I think is your history. I also put it in here so kids can look at it. And I think that's all. Okay. Those were difficult times. How are we doing? Oh, we're moving along. I'm going to. This is sort of about a difficult time. It's talking about the relationship between the people who owned the factory, who managed it, and all of those workers who worked at workstations. Remember them in the videos? And I could make this longer. Right now it's pretty short, but I want to show you some disagreements. How did automobile companies, people who managed it, the people who wrote the paychecks, the people who figured out what kind of cars to build before they made a lot of important decisions. But one of the decisions was how to pay the workers and how to make the assembly line go. Would it go too fast? Would it go too slow? Would it drive the workers crazy? Um, and we're going to see that sometimes there were disagreements. And my example is from the 1930s. This is a fight. This is a fight between the men who are working for the company's management and automobile workers. And they're outside a plant fighting. Why? Well, one of the big issues that would come up, and it really did in 1937, because this was during the Depression, was how much the company was paying the workers who were at the workstations. And you know how there were the big three? Well, there was something called a strike in Flint, Michigan, at the very biggest and most important factory owned by General Motors. And the men, you can see what the workers look like. They are right now guarding even the windows. They did not want anybody to come into this factory. They didn't want anybody to come in because they did what was called a sit down. They stopped all the work and they said, nobody is going to come in this factory, not through the windows and not through the doors, until we get to talk about our pay, because they were really hurting. At this time, they were making less per hour than people in other kinds of manufacturing. This was so serious. And this is an amazing photo. These are National Guard soldiers. This is Michigan National Guard. And they were sent by the governor of Michigan, Governor Murphy. And he sent them to prevent fighting. He did not want any people hired by either side to come beating on the factory or come beating on men. He wanted to get this settled without fighting, because that's what had been happening before. And to show you how serious this was, for 44 days, because of that work stoppage in Flint, Michigan, by a group of workers who wanted to talk about getting paid more, because they stopped Flint, Michigan, 150,000 workers of General Motors could not work in 50 other plants, factories throughout the United States. It was horrible. There were 150,000 people couldn't work. And that was getting hard on families. So the President of the United States said, you all have to come to Washington, D.C., and I want you to sit down and get together. Except they refused to get together in the same room. So what you see here is the president of General Motors. The president of General Motors came to Washington, D.C. He sat next to a representative of the President of the United States, who was sitting next to Governor Murphy. Do you know why it's really important that Governor Murphy was there? Because the union guys representing the workers were not in the same room. Governor Murphy had to carry messages between the president of General Motors and the representatives of the unions. This is like not getting along. Governor Murphy here is standing with union representatives in their room. They really wanted to end the strike. Governor Murphy went back and forth between the two rooms. And what were the results? The workers agreed in Flint to go back to work. That meant workers in 50 other factories would be able to go back to work. All General Motors GM workers got a 5% pay increase, so they would be more like the average worker in the rest of the United States, and GM agreed to let the union talk to workers. Ford was the last company. Ford had basically very wisely tried to keep the pay for his workers high. But even the Ford company by 1941, this is about this is later, after, this is 1941, not 1937. But Ford, it was going to turn out that there were going to be bad fights with people hitting each other with sticks and baseball bats. And he just didn't want that. It's real interesting. His wife said, "You do not want that. Do not allow people to fight." And so in 1941, he agreed that the workers could come, and this was being supervised by the federal government. And the workers came and they voted on whether they wanted to have a union at his factory, in his largest factory, River Rouge factory in Detroit, and they did vote for the union. I know there are disagreements about the power of automobile companies and the power of unions. So I think this is something that people in the United States keep working on. Oops, here we go. That was the end of that one. Make that escape, and I'm not escaping. Ah. Okay, now we escaped. Something that I still need to do is, it is just fascinating. There are so many laws that the government has made that involve cars. For example, it took the government making laws about roads so that you could use automobiles in Michigan and that you could go across the entire United States. Governments, so that's both state and federal government, made laws about roads and funding of roads. And we still are worried about how to fix them. Government also made laws about how to support automobile companies during bad times. There actually were worse times than the Depression that I showed you, when the federal government bailed out, gave billions of dollars or loaned billions of dollars to the big three so they wouldn't go bankrupt. So I will try to make a shorter summary about that. Just Luann is more attuned to suggestions for ways for fourth grade students to review. One thing that they could do, which is very personal, and because we're humans, we use automobiles, and it's to ask an older family member their experience with cars or trucks, because they're both passenger vehicles, that were in the past. So that would be a fun way to review and take the personal side of things.
Well, because almost everyone has a car.
Yeah.
And almost I mean, I'm sure, Dave, you feel the same way, but when you were 16, having a car was one of the most important things in your life. And so asking people what was their first car and if you remember, do they remember what the gas prices were, and what kind of a car is out there that you wish was being made again, all those just little things like that that could just get a conversation started with the students and an older person. And hopefully they would talk about you have to roll down your window with the crank. Because we say roll down the windows. If you ask a kid now, how do you roll down the windows in the car? They go boop. Yeah. So just
and in winter, in 1956, no, I'm sorry, like 1955 in Minnesota, our car, it didn't heat up. There was no way to get the frost off the inside of the windows. You had to put these funny plastic things so you could see out your side windows. And certainly, oh my goodness, yes, you cranked down the window, but there was power nothing back then.
Right. And it would be fun to have the, especially, and like we were talking earlier, it needs to be not really their parents' generation, although that would be cool, but the grandparents' generation would be the one to really, or great grandparents if they have them around. So
Luann also had wonderful suggestions. You could research a highway, or you could research an automobile company, or you could research your town, Muskegon. What got built in Muskegon? I know I was looking at Kalamazoo where I live, and there were at least 17 car manufacturing companies in Kalamazoo. They didn't all last. They might have lasted 5 years or 10 years. The one that did last the longest was the Checker Cab Company of Kalamazoo. So,
in little bitty Frankfort, we have Frankfort Manufacturing, and they, at one point in time, I don't know if they still do, but they were making car parts that they would send out, parts for cars, like door handles, or I'm not really sure what it was, but yeah.
So we have done most of the things, and I really need to take you to lesson 2. And Luann and I promised to get this done by early May, but we figure we've got enough in lesson 1 to be one step ahead of the sheriff. And I can show you, what we're trying to do is get us closer to the present and say what is happening, what happened after the 1920s and the 1930s, and what's happening today. So this is what follows afterwards. And I can show you just a draft, which will get better. And this is kind of big, so we'll do a slideshow. And I'm just going to show you 4 slides, I think. We had started this about 5 years ago. And where do you think the largest cities are located? It was closer to 20. We had 2010 data back then. Well, back in 2010, notice where the largest cities are. And do you see very many near the Great Lakes? No, you see some really big ones over by the Atlantic Ocean, and you see these groups in the warmer parts of the United States. So what is especially important here, though, is you don't see a top 10 city in Michigan. And we're going to look at a little bit, just a tiny bit of change between 1860 and more recently. In 1860, We did have Chicago, and we did have St. Louis, and we did have New Orleans falling in the top 10, and Buffalo. That's where the Nowlin family left from. And then the really big ones are right next to the Atlantic Ocean, with New York City being really big. We've already looked at 2010. So, who's in the top 10 obviously changes through time. But there was a time. Notice, who's this? We've got Detroit as the 4th biggest city in the United States in 1920. And what do you think was happening then? The big 3 car companies. Okay? 1950. We've still got Detroit being big. Big 3 car companies. It was a big deal. Now, not everybody worked in the car companies, but you had enough people, thousands of people working there, who would then go to restaurants or buy things from grocery stores or buy shoes. So other people had jobs because the big jobs were being done by the big 3 automobile companies. So there was a time when Detroit was in the top 10. And so that's a kind of a hint of what's coming. And we'll look at who moved to. I've got one more to bring us up to date with some recent data. And it always takes me a while to make things big enough so that simple enough so fourth graders can see them. But this is data for 2023, recently. Which country produces the most motor vehicles? Can you tell, or should I move? The top 5. China produced 30 million vehicles. United States, more than 10 million. But look who else is high. Japan, India, South Korea. This is really impressive. The United States is right up there, but China is gangbusters. Now, it probably is important to know that China's population is 3 times larger than the United States. And India, India's population is more than 3 times larger than the United States. So it's kind of logical that countries with big populations would produce a lot of cars. But I think this is I think I need to figure out how to make this as clear as possible for fourth graders. Just to think about Michigan, this is pretty recent 2024 data about United States. Which state has the most workers working in automobile manufacturing? And look at the top. This is workers in making the assembled cars that then get sold. And this is in thousands. So notice the 48,000 workers in Michigan. That is higher than any other state in the United States. Those big 3 companies being in Michigan is really important in our history. Same way, it's even more interesting. Parts. Remember how in a modern car, has 30,000 parts. Those parts are made in smaller plants in towns, as it so happens, throughout Michigan. Look at the number of 118,000 people, workers, making parts in Michigan. The next highest state is next door. That's Ohio. And the next state after that is Indiana. That's really amazing, I think, how important this is for workers. Um, this may be way too complicated for kids, but it may be important for teachers. Remember how we talked about, well, there is kind of a problem. This is how many automobiles get produced in the United States every year. It does go up and down, but basically the whole thing is coming down to now.
Down, yeah.
And we have to think about that. Also, these gray times, this was a horrible time. This is when the federal government, this is when there was something like a depression in the United States. And it was a hard time. A lot of people temporarily lost their jobs. But definitely people were not able to buy cars. And so what happened is the federal government did bailouts. It did not want the big three to go out of business. So that's, this is manufacturing in general. I see a region in the center part of the United States that does a lot of manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we got to get to major section now that I can show you at the bottom part. Here we go. And this is, I hope this is good. This is Luann's turn. Do you want me to make this run for you?
If you would, please, that would be great. Civics is a part of fourth grade. So I just, I put together, it's pretty basic. It's kind of long because there's so many parts to our government, as you know. And I tried, and it was hard for parts of it to be just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. What does the Constitution say? This is what the president does. This is what Congress does. This is what. So anyway, we start with civics. What is the study of civics? And define it there with rights and duties and how the government is supposed to work for its citizens and the structure of government. And I had a fun fact in there, and it was half done, and I realized it. I went back in, and that fun fact was I couldn't remember what I was going to put there. So I thought, you know what? Let's talk about the Constitution because, our whole government, everything is based on the Constitution. And it's the oldest and shortest written constitution of any major government in the world. It's not the oldest. I found that out today because I had always heard that it was the oldest, but this is a very small part in the world. They have a constitution that's way older than ours. But talk about major countries, talk about major contributions. It's us. It's us. We rock. So government is how a nation, state, or community makes laws, takes taxes, protects, and helps its citizens. And I wanted to make sure that we write, because everyone talks about democracy, and democracy is important, but our government is a republic. Could you imagine if everyone had to vote all the time on every single thing? Oh. No. I mean, yeah. So having representatives, voting on representatives to go, represent us for the government and making laws is important. And that everything is, we elect them. And So that's what the government is. They're supposed to do the will of the citizens, and I just kind of let that go. I didn't want to say they don't always do what they're supposed to do. So okay, go ahead. How do we know? What do we know about voting? Voting is in elections is important. It's how our government runs. I like, Carol, how you put that in there. Think about times when your parents voted or your neighbors voted. Times you've had a chance to vote in school or in your family. And in fifth grade, when I taught it, I used the word popular sovereignty every single time we voted for something. What kind of party are we going to have? What are we going to, and so we would vote. And so I made sure that I used that word all the time. And thankfully they remembered it when it came time for the spring testing. So something that you could do. Of course, now we're in Unit 4. So after doing this for a year, then maybe teachers can use it at the beginning of their next year. What do we mean by government? The people are elected to the U.S. government and do different kinds of work. They make rules and laws, and then others carry out the rules and laws. And we always wanted to come back full circle to Mr. Noland. He moved to Michigan in 1934, and the government helped him to be successful. And so then, Carol, you are right on it. Thank you so much. He elected people in Congress, made a law about selling land that U.S. had governed. So we go back to the Northwest Ordinance and how the president signed it and said that people could buy lots of 80 acres from the U.S. government for a reasonable price in Michigan, and that the president set up land offices where people could look at a map to buy the land they wanted. And Mr. Nowlin did that. He went to a government office in Detroit, bought 80 acres near Dearbornville, and later got a deed that had the U.S. president's signature on it. And Dave, Carol and I were talking earlier about how she and I we get so geeked out about Dearborn and the Nowlins and bringing everything back to the Nowlins and their story. And there's one more that we have to add, Carol, at the very end, in that Henry Ford, one of the big threes, was born in Dearborn, very close to where the Nowlins bought the property.
Yeah, it's so cool.
So, we're going to go full circle here at the end.
I want to go back and visit Detroit and Dearborn.
Every time I hear the name Dearborn, I think of the Nowlin family. I think of that settlement story. So we talk about how the government is set up. We have our government. We have a constitution, which is the framework that guides the U.S. government for work with its citizens. And that 200 years ago, representatives worked hard to write the guidelines. The founding fathers who represented the citizens at the time took the new constitution back to their home areas. And by 1788, it was ratified. So we have a constitution that's the framework. And this is, direct lickies. What's the first paragraph? What is the preamble? What does it do? So this is the preamble of the Constitution. It's very short, but the main ideas about what the citizens wanted the government to do. So that's there. And then on the next 2 slides, we go through what each section, what each part means. And what's interesting is, Dave, I don't know if you remember, we had the National Studies, National Council for Social Studies, NCSS, had done workbooks called We the People. There's a 5th grade version, an 8th grade version, and a high school version. And I don't know where they are, but it did such a great job of doing this part of breaking down, what the preamble of the Constitution means and all the different parts of it and what we want. We want peace with each other and we want to be protected. And, the last one, making sure the government's making laws to benefit the citizens. And then blessings of liberty and all of that. And then I must have put it on a different one because there is a Schoolhouse Rock.
Oh,
the preamble of the Constitution. I must have put it on a different version of this.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll make sure.
Well, I don't know how many versions of this I had open, so I have no idea. So some of the updates I made, I'll have to switch over. But yeah, the preamble of the Constitution is a Schoolhouse Rock video, and my kids loved it. They would want, what music are we listening to? We want the preamble. This You're crazy, but okay. And the kids could sing it. They would sing the preamble and they knew it, which was awesome. I just added this about the
Oh,
amendment.
good.
The
Yeah.
preamble is the beginning, and then the amendments. And I just did the first 5 amendments, why we have them there, what Great Britain was doing, which is a little bit more history than probably fourth graders need to know. But why do we have them? Because Great Britain was being they were not nice to us and they wouldn't let us have freedom of speech. They would burn or destroy presses. Freedom of religion was one of the founding, the first colonists were here because of that. And so I do the first 5 amendments. 5 I have highlighted because I don't like the way it's written, so I've got to fix that. So just no soldiers can be quartered. No unreasonable search and seizures. So anyway, yeah, 5 I got to fix because I don't know how to put it in fourth grade terms about taking the fifth. You can't be forced to testify against yourself, because people they'll have heard it from TV shows or movies about pleading the fifth. So I don't like how, because those parts are in there, but
Sorry.
that's okay. Pleading the fifth is something we hear a lot. And then the branches of government, I like, Carol, how you put, which of these have you heard about?
Have you heard of these guys?
Have you heard of the president?
Or
Gee, I'm sure you've heard of courts and judges lately. But yeah, like Dave, Carol, and I talked about today, by the time teachers teach this next year, there might be totally different things going on, and it might not. Who knows what will be going on? Yeah, we don't. We just want to be. Here it is. So, I don't know if I want to keep this because I explain it more in later slides.
Oh, here's Schoolhouse Rock.
There's the Schoolhouse Rock, but I moved those two under each branch. So if you, go to the next slide, please. So I put it in a graph. It was something that MC3 actually had something very similar to it that I taught for years. And the M step has a drag and drop question, or it did, in fifth grade, that where you're doing the branches of government set up like this. What does the legislative branch do? Makes the laws. Who is it? And all 3 branches. And then I have a drag and drop. I think I put it in another lesson in one of the earlier units, but then I put it back in here too. So I think the next slide might have it. No, it's in there somewhere. So there's a drag and drop that teachers can, push out to the kids and have them put the right thing in the right spot. So, what are the levels of government? Federal, state, and local. So this is the older one because I have the one that I was working on. I had done federal government, and I had done several slides about the federal government, several slides about the state, several slides about the local. So I'll have to send that to you. And then we correlate it with the state government. The executive branch is the president, it's the governor. And I hopefully they'll notice what's interesting is all 3 are elected. All 3 branches are elected.
Oh,
The governor's elected, the legislators are elected, and the Supreme Court is elected in Michigan. They're not appointed like our national court.
Yeah.
So, no, it's okay. So this goes back to, federal government laws for the entire company or country, interstate highways, coining money, and how, we talked about the Nowlin family. When they first got to Michigan, they were paid for their goods in Michigan script, which wasn't very valuable. When Mr. Nowlin worked to help build the fort, he was paid in Michigan script, which ended up being like $2 as opposed to the $6 it was supposed to be. And then the federal government collects taxes. We have our military, things to help the government run, highway system. And remember that the government was creating the road in Dearborn, that the Nowlin family helped create a section of the Plank Road. And the federal government makes deals with other countries for trade and protection. It's pretty. State government. So these are the ones that I redid, the new ones. Okay, so I've totally screwed up. I thought they were in a different spot in the slideshow. That's my fault. They tax people to help run the state with roads and the government and the police, taking care of the major roads in the state, licensing for lifestyle choices, hunting, fishing, driver's license. I need to put in their marriage licenses. Can't get married without a license. The state helps fund local schools, and the state government takes care of everything not covered in the Constitution. So, and then local government, villages, cities, towns, townships, the local governments tax its citizens to help pay for the local police, local fire department, local roads, elections, and schools. So if there's pieces that are missing, please, throw them in, we'll throw them in there.
Yeah. Sorry. So I don't think, did you put anything at, nah, these were,
just some fun facts. Were those just copies? Just some fun facts about the presidents, some fun facts about the Constitution.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. When George H. Bush, no, it's George W. Sorry, George W. was elected, I was so excited just because we could say we had a father-son again, like we did with John Adams and John Quincy. So
cool.
Okay.
All right. Something else. More fun.
And then this is just about the Great Compromise, about how the founding fathers. I like this because they were ready to give up, and I love the story. And they were like, oh, the small states were like, that's not fair. The big states, well, we have more people, and we have to take care. We have more people to take care of. And of course, the big states also like, oh, we got to do something about slavery, so we got to add slavery to our, the 3/4. The 3/5 clause. I didn't put that in there. But thank goodness Roger Sherman came up with the Great Compromise. And now we have both. And, I did add, like, right now, Michigan sends 13 representatives. And in the 1950s, we sent 17 because we had more people in the state, mostly because of the automotive industry.
I think one thing I need to do is graphs of change through time the population of Detroit, and change through time the population of Michigan, and I need to be able to have the students put some of the bars onto the graph.
Okay, yeah.
So, okay, I think we're at the end of that.
Yeah, yep. I was thinking too, and we haven't done it yet, but that can be in our late April, early May work. Going through the economics glickies, and just when I was reading them, I'm like, oh, we covered that in the Nowlin story. Oh, we covered that in the Nowlin story. And so just to go through, we can just do each glick and talk about, they bartered, they traded, supply and demand. They supplied the first watermelon ever sold in Detroit. Things like that.
And it's like the Glicks talk about something, they use the word market. Mm-hmm. And that's not just the grocery store.
Right.
There was, we really need to think about the selling of cars by the big three as there's a market, there's a seller, and you hope that there are buyers. So the market is the place where buyers and sellers get together. Mm-hmm. And that would be my simple way of meeting that click, is to use that example.
And how it changed when we had the oil embargo and we have these great big huge American-made cars that are not fuel efficient. And then that's when you get your Volkswagens and your Toyotas, and then later Honda and all the different smaller cars, fuel efficient. And we still look at that, we look at, oh my gosh, that, we had a Honda Civic that got almost 40 miles to the gallon when you're on the highway, which is just phenomenal. which was awesome. So
Yeah, when we were young, my very first car, and I'm 80 years old, and my very first, well, when I married Phil, I wasn't 80, but we were still going to school, and the pickup truck only got 12 miles to the gallon,
Mhm.
and we had to sell it. We could not afford it
Mhm.
anymore. We got a little bitty French car that I always thought was dangerous. It wasn't as big, but we could afford to buy gasoline.
I mean, we could do a project with the kids doing the technology improvements or the safety improvements. You know, I didn't have to wear a seatbelt when I was a kid. I remember riding in the front of a truck, running back and forth on the bench seat, tagging
Oh,
my mom and then tagging the window and tagging while she's driving. You know, so your kids could do some really cool things about
yeah,
that.
the change, and actually, it is Congress. It is the federal government making rules about. First, it was lap belts, and then there was rules about shoulder belts,
Mhm.
and there literally were rules about padding. You had to have more padding in case people were thrown around, even padding behind their head, for example. So there are things that I think students could relate to. So writing about government and automobiles is going to be very interesting.
Sure, absolutely. So
So we are pretty close.
we're close. We didn't even get to take a break. Carol, you talked. Are you okay?
Yeah,
You did a
I'm
great
going
job.
to sleep. You can cut this out, but I'm going to sleep well tonight. I've had 2 nights in a row where I was up till 2 in the morning. It's like I get on a roll. Oh dear. Hey, Dave, did Phil tell you? He wrote down for me, okay, every first draft is perfect because the only job of a first draft is to exist. Isn't that wonderful?
Mhm. That's a good one.
I, 2 weeks ago, it occurred to me I need to have some drafts existing. I had all this research and notes and folders with pictures in them, and these had to be coming into PowerPoints. And they did.
Mhm.
So, anyway, this has been a lot of fun.